Hello and welcome to PPC Town Hall. My name is Fred Valles. I'm your host. I'm also CEO and co-founder at Optimizer, a PPC management software suite. For today's episode, we're going to talk about generative AI in marketing, a topic we've discussed quite a bit. But what's unique about today's episode is we have Ted Konno from Google. And so he's going to share a little bit about the perspective from Google, how generative AI can help marketers with better keywords, better targeting, better ads. And of course, being from Google, we're going to talk about how Gemini fits into all of this. So I'm very excited to hear the Google perspective on generative AI. I hope you are too. And with that, let's get rolling with this episode of PPC Town Hall. Ted, welcome to the show. Good to have you on.
Hey Fred, yeah, thanks for having me. Very glad to be here.
You're calling in from Google in the Netherlands, right? Tell us where you're located.
Yes, exactly. So I'm based in the Google Amsterdam office. It's a little bit towards the end of the day here. And my role here is basically a performance specialist. So I try to help our largest advertisers and agencies in the region to get the most out of Google Ads. I've been doing it for about 6.5 years. And before that, I used to work at iProspect, also for about 4 years. Been in the PPC game since the days of manual bidding still.
Nice. Yeah, and the Dutch or the Amsterdam-based advertisers, some of the world's largest are from there, right? So some of the travel companies like Booking, that's a Dutch company. So they tend to know what they're doing. They tend to be pretty sophisticated. So I always love talking to someone from the Dutch market because I think you guys have a lot of agencies are there, a lot of tools actually get developed out of the Netherlands. So it's an interesting market where a lot of the some of the smartest minds in PPC are all together. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about your experiences, both from the agency level and now being at Google. But then, yeah, I think some of the guests that we've had on PPC Town Hall before, you're friends with them, right?
Yeah, exactly. As I said, I used to work at iProspect Canal, so one of a few of your former guests, Wijnand from TrueClicks, the founder, and Marcel from Roots. I've worked with them. They basically taught me a lot about PPC and how it works. And actually, we used to work with Optimizer quite a bit in our agency days. For me, it's quite a full circle moment that I've been using your tools, reading your books, but now also I'm a guest here. So yeah, very excited to be here. And also, how I got here is that I connected with your colleague Neva last year, and we were both speaking at Friends of Search, which is a conference here in the Netherlands. Also, I think a very great conference based out of, again, the tiny little Amsterdam.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I think I was just in London for SMX London. It seems like in the United States, all the conferences have largely gone virtual, which
Hmm.
is really it's good for me because I can sit in my studio, I can record something for an hour, and I can get it out to lots of people without having to travel. But in Europe, there still seems to be much more that one-on-one connection and conferences. And I think Forenza Search, for anyone who hasn't checked it out, it is quite a large one. It's really well organized. They got good food, great speakers. It's a great city to be in. So that's coming back again, I think, in the late winter, early spring of every year that happens. So check it out, Friends of Search. I'll be speaking there this year. And they usually
Nice.
rotate speakers. So I think you spoke last year, so you'll be taking this year off and then back the year after that,
I
right?
can now just sit back in the audience and enjoy the show rather than being a bit nervous about speaking. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm very curious about your talk as well.
Yeah. And my talk will be about AI, to like which talk these days isn't. Tell us, what was your talk about last year at Friends of Search?
Partially also about AI, but we presented more of a broader framework on how we think marketers, but PPCers in general, could be more successful by following a three-step framework. We used to call it the AI marketing flywheel. And I think, we focused on Gen AI, and we'll do so as well in this talk. But I think it's also very important to not forget the power of predictive AI, the importance of setting the right goals and data, and have a testing framework in place to keep proving that. So that was my talk last year.
Yeah. And that's interesting because you just alluded to the fact that there's the predictive AI, which was the state of the art a number of years ago before ChatGPT showed us what a generative transformer can do. But honestly, quality score, which has been around at Google for what now, 20 years basically, that was artificial intelligence. That was a machine learning prediction system. It still is to this day. And so we've all, in some form, been using AI for much longer than I think we realize. But now with this generative AI, it's opened up whole new doors, right? It's no longer about we give something to Google and it uses AI to predict what's going to happen with that. We can go to Google and say, hey, I don't know what to give you. Help me with ads, help me with images, help me with keywords. So give us maybe a little bit of that broader perspective on what is the state of AI and how do you see it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think exactly like you said, generative AI is obviously revolutionizing a lot of the steps in the marketing journey. But as I alluded to earlier, I think there are still a lot of powerful opportunities and things out there that are maybe not generative AI and still being used by a lot of us, maybe without realizing. About smart bidding, for example, which has been around for years, but still very powerful, but also predictive AI in some other areas. When you think about the steps of how to be successful in AI, I think as a PPC marketer, setting the right goal to start with, having the right data in place and the right KPIs is a very interesting starting point. Then feeding that to AI and enhancing it with generative and improving is the framework that I use a lot. But then when we think about those goals, I think predictive AI can have a very impactful for role in that by predicting future outcomes, for example. So if I can give an example, I worked on a case, so maybe I'm a bit biased because I worked on it myself. So I was actually working with a Dutch fashion retailer, Omoda, and their goal is obviously to sell a lot of clothes profitably. However, a big problem that we were facing is that 50% of their bought items were actually returned, but you don't notice until about 30 days after the fact. So how can we make sure that we feed bidding with the right data? And what we did there is we used Vertex AI, our enterprise AI environment, to actually, based on historical data and BigQuery, predict the moment of a transaction, how likely it was that someone would return a product or not. And the value that was predicted at that point was fed into bidding. It's obviously not 100% accurate, but it was around 75% accurate and actually drove a lot of bottom line profitability for the company. I think that just speaks to the fact that generative AI is definitely great, and we'll go into it much deeper in this podcast. But don't forget, I would say, the power of some of the predictive AI that's out there as well to help predict what a business outcome might be.
And that's super interesting, right? And I think a lot of experts talk about this need for sharing the correct goals with the machine and think of the machine as a colleague. And a colleague couldn't do a good job if you didn't communicate what it is you actually want. And so sometimes you say, I want lead forms being filled out on my page, but that's not really what you want, right? You want those leads to be high quality. You want them to convert into
Exactly.
sales. And so we see problems, I think, at both sides of the spectrum where some advertisers are simply too small to get enough like true conversions, even like a good lead form fill. And so the struggle then becomes how do you go higher up in that consumer journey to maybe detect that, oh, they downloaded a white paper or they engaged with certain pages, and maybe that's a good signal. And what you're talking about is that other end of the spectrum where maybe it's a bigger advertiser and they already get like actual sales data, they get actual profitability data, but how much of that is being returned? Um, and then
Exactly.
and to talk a little bit more like when it comes to using Vertex AI, like how big of a project is this? Like is this truly reserved for enterprise level advertisers? Or what does it take? What staffing do you have to have? How much data do you need to have to make this work?
Yeah, I think in general, personally speaking, I think that was the case quite some years ago. But I think there has been not only in generative AI, but AI in general, a lot of developments to make these models and how to run it more accessible. And maybe a lot of pre-made models have been in the works. For as an example, we have the returns, which is quite a custom case, and you probably need some data scientists for it. Omoda worked with an agency to get that going, which worked well. However, when you talk about, for example, predicting the lifetime value of a certain audience, we also have some templatized solutions for you that are on GitHub. One is called Crystal Value, for example, which then obviously you still need to understand how to read a GitHub repository and deploy that. However, I think the sort of the bar of how much is needed and how much staff is needed to actually make a project like this work is getting the resources needed are getting less and less, I think, and that's opens up opportunities for other for a larger pool of advertisers to make sense of this.
Interesting. And do you think any of these capabilities could also be deployed in a scenario where you maybe do have the data scientist, but you don't have enough conversion volume at the start of a campaign? You're maybe looking higher up in the journey and saying, okay, we get all of these visitors to the site and they're doing something, but use a predictive model to say of these behaviors, which ones correlate to that end state of a sales qualified lead?
Yeah, exactly. I think in your case, and I think you're talking about the lead gen example quite a bit, obviously, but I think that is exactly how we position it, and especially for lead gen advertisers that have very long sales cycles, it's quite hard to, even if you have a lot of volume, it's quite hard to give bidding the right data of that end conversion because simply the path for to purchase is 90 days after a click. So a lot of the times, big or small advertisers use sort of signals or micro conversions to that are a good predictor of an end conversion. And I think making that prediction or at least initial valuation of what that will be worth can be done quite easily based on long and big amounts of historical data. But then in real time, when you feed the building algorithm, you can rely on that and that prediction. Yeah.
Yeah, and you astutely pointed out that I'm maybe drawing us towards lead gen. So let's go back to e-commerce for a second because that was your example, right? So you got these sales, and then half of the sales for a particular fashion brand might be returned. I hear in Germany it's 70%. It's like
Yeah,
crazy
it's yeah,
stuff
that's
being
quite a
returned.
challenging market. Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to that, do you also look at passing the profit and the margin data, or do you just look at the basket value? What are some other layers of optimization that you can do to maybe take this down to what actually matters to a business, which I guess at the end of the day is usually profit?
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm very glad to hear or have a conversation around this topic because I think more and more advertisers are realizing that just ROAS is not really a meaningful metric. And at the end of the day, most businesses care about maximizing, profitability in the short and long term. But yeah, I can allude to this with the Amoda example still. It is a public case as well. It has even been mentioned in the Wall Street Journal, actually. So maybe you can sort of look that up. But yeah, they definitely care about profitability. So what happened is that, of course, for that business, margin is very important, but returns are have a much larger effect on the bottom line. So I think what we did is looking at the basket that is being bought, we calculate sort of the margin and then take also into account the return predictability, and then we come up with a profit value, which is based on the margin, but also the likelihood to return, which is then end game and end value for that advertiser. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's then when we have terms like value-based bidding, which can be it's generally deployed for e-commerce where you want to communicate the actual value of something, but you can also do it on lead gen, right? So you could say, okay, this lead
Yeah.
is worth more than that lead, and so hence the bidding algorithm can become more sophisticated. Now, when it comes to value-based bidding, historically, like when it comes to things like returns, this usually pivots on the GCLID or some transaction ID, some parameter that Google gives to the advertiser. You put that in your system, and later on, you communicate back to Google for this transaction ID. Actually, it wasn't a transaction, or maybe this much was returned, or for this GCLID, it turned out to be a really good lead or a really bad lead. But then there's questions about durability, right? Google talks about durability of these tracking solutions quite a bit in a more privacy centric world. So, talk us a little bit through what's the state of the art today in terms of the data pieces you need, and what are we looking at tomorrow to make sure this will work into the future?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a valid point, and actually also a point that we are discussing with a lot of advertisers here, because there are indeed quite some advertisers that are relying on, yeah, let's say uploads after the fact, if that is a good term, which relies on things like order ID or a Google Click ID. And without going in too much like technical detail, we are seeing and are expecting that sort of the reliance on those single identifiers is not something that it will be super durable over time. So our recommendation is to move towards or think about a future where measurement is basically tag based, whether it's client side tag or server side, and then how to potentially a solution on dealing with these challenges, like sometimes you only know what an actual lead was worth or what a product was returned after the fact. You could use AI, like in the example I described, to predict some of those outcomes rather than having to wait for it to actually be true. And I think it is a tricky balance though between how fast you can give that information and how accurate it is. But especially given the circumstances in this measurement ecosystem, I think that makes sense. For lead gen, you triggered me with an example. We do have a solution, for example, that's called Enhanced Conversions for Leads, which also relies on hash PII data and still allows for uploads after the fact, if you will, in a durable way.
Yeah, and then so some of the common questions that I will hear around these identifiers and uploading data after the fact, there's a couple of them. So even though Google has a fairly long window in which you can report back on some conversion value having changed, I often hear Google say the sooner the better, right? And even if the data is less precise, we'd rather know very quickly that something was good or bad than knowing exactly how good or how bad it was, but waiting 2 months for that. So, do you have a take on, from your experience, what sort of that time frame, and also talk about the consistency, because that's the other thing I've heard Google say is it almost matters more that you're consistently reporting back after the same number of days, as opposed to sometimes it's after 5 days, sometimes it's after 15 days. So talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to start with the latter piece, that is definitely something we also recommend. So consistency in upload times is definitely a good one to keep, let's say, the algorithm stable. So try, if you are using offline conversion imports, for example, or conversion adjustments, try to keep the timing and the frequency that you do those with as consistent as possible. That will definitely help us. Now, to the first part of the question on how long is too long, basically, it is a very hard one to answer, to be honest, and we don't really have statistics on that, so it's a bit of a disappointing answer. But in general, I do see and feel indeed that the sooner we have that information, the better. And as you said, even if it's not 100% accurate, it might be better also for building algorithms to stay with that value instead of correcting it all the time, because then we need to readjust and relearn a bit, relearn a little bit how we set those bits. I think it's also, to be honest, very much dependent on the advertiser. So yeah, it is a bit of a typical Google answer, but yeah, in general, the sooner the better. Consistency of and frequency to keep that consistent is very, very important.
And I think it's a fair answer. It always depends in PPC.
Yeah,
But that's where you get into these complex situations, right? So, say that somebody buys a bunch of clothes and they return two pieces after a week, and then another week later, they're like, these other bunch of pieces come back. So, you end up having these multiple stages when you could communicate back to Google that some amount of value has changed. But I guess your point is, don't make these micro adjustments too frequently. If there's like a big meaningful change, then report that back. Try to be consistent about it. And usually the returns policy window is the thing that gives you at least some consistency. Like after 30 days, we can say this is now a locked in conversion value. But then, yeah, if you think about machine learning in general and statistics, if you basically go 2 months of having assumed one thing, and then after those 2 months, you say, okay, actually, what's different? There's like this bigger window in which things were still going the old way. And for that 60 days of bad data to be smoothed into the new averages of where it's better, it's clearly going to have, it's going to take longer for you to see the results that you want. Whereas if you report back to Google within 3 days that something was good or bad, then you only deal with that 3 day window when it was imperfect, and that gets smoothed out much more quickly. I think from some level, it's not purely about just what is the machine learning good at, but like the results that you as a human look at. Are you able to understand that, yes, on the 61st day, it started working better? But if you're looking at 2 months of data, that one day, which is like 1.5%, even if it was a fantastic day, you might still look at horrible data. And that's the thing that we have to
yeah,
sort of.
exactly. And you also have to keep think about the how is it being used for decision making and bidding as well. So obviously it's more accurate, and some of that data, even if you upload it like 40, 50 days after a click, or sorry, after original conversion, will still matter. But of course, we also take recency into account when it's about conversion values. Yeah, instead of striving for perfection, try, as you said as well, live by that 80/20 rule and just be consistent in that. And then I think outcome wise and actionability wise, you will have the best outcome.
Great. So you've covered really well sort of this machine learning predictive mechanism. Now let's dive into, and sorry, I keep using dive into. I've been trained by GPT to use the word dive into, delve into a little too much. But let's dive into generative AI. And so where does that fit in? So we've communicated the right conversion values to the system so it can make better decisions for us. What can we do with generative AI to make our campaigns better?
Yeah, I think, quite a lot, obviously. If it's okay with you, though, I think because sometimes I think as marketers, as PPCers, we obviously, for good reasons, jump to what can sort of we do within marketing or within PPC to make our lives better, to get better results with generative or predictive AI. But I think we're also at quite an exciting time, to be honest, in just the how the consumer experience is on
Mhm.
search through generative AI, right? If I think back on how the search engine result page looked 10 years ago when I started, when predominantly people were searching on desktop, it was like a list of blue links with yellow backgrounds. That obviously has changed drastically. And luckily, I think over those years, you can see that search is becoming much more than this text box. We are sort of having multiple entry points on how we search for information. And generative AI is, I think, playing a very big role in the sort of type of questions that people are able to ask, but also the type of answers that we can give. And I think talking about sort of the type of questions we can ask, it's very hard through a text prompt to ask us an exact plant that you're maybe seeing outside, which can be now solved by using Google Lens, and then you'll get good search results. Or this was one of my favorite examples from Google Marketing Live this year, where we used actually we saw that a sort of record player was broken. We filmed what was happening, and then through speech we asked, "Why is this happening?" And then this AI in this multimodal context was very much able to give a very good and concise answer through AI overviews in generative. So I think generative AI is transforming marketing, but it's also transforming how consumers are interacting with search and how we are seeing that. Particularly, and I think our sort of latest example, obviously, is AI overviews, which we talked a little bit about yesterday during our earnings call. It has rolled out to a lot of countries. More than 1 billion people have access to it. And actually, interestingly, people are actually more satisfied with the results. They're searching more. Younger users, in particular, are engaging a lot more with that with AI overviews. Um, and people actually also the type of traffic that advertisers are getting are also of higher quality. People tend to spend more time on the destination sites, etc. So I think that's all very interesting changes in the consumer experience, and also leads to a lot of opportunities, I think, for advertisers to actually be in more places, be more relevant with the ads that they are creating, and how they can be matched to intent.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I mean, the way that I look at it too is for 2+ decades, we've become accustomed to search being a certain way. Like you said, it was blue links, right? It was different colors and it was slightly different layouts of the page. And Google obviously got better at driving relevance and doing a number of things. But the underlying experience was always the same. But now it's so fundamentally different because, like you said, you use your camera to film and you narrate what is the question, and the summarization, the generative AI just picks up on that. It pulls together all the best sources and then summarizes, and you start having a conversation which draws you into it, right? Like you find out something you didn't know, but it's very easy to ask a follow-up question. So you ask that follow-up question that in the past you might have just walked away from. Now, and Microsoft had shared some data in the past, so I'd love to know some specifics from what Google announced yesterday at the earnings call. But Microsoft was saying that the click-through rate on ads within the Copilot experience was higher because the generative system, the memory element of the Gen AI, fundamentally understands the consumer better and what it is they're looking for, and so it's better able to match ads, and hence they get a higher click-through rate. Did Google say anything about click-through rates and relevance of the ads?
No, not directly and not with like exact statistics, but we, as I said, with what we do see is that people engage more. So they actually search more if we're in the AI overview context, which is interesting because the answer and the query is usually also quite long and complex and to the point already. What we are seeing though is that, as I said as well, people are spending more time on those destination sites when they actually land. So this is, I think, an indication of the relevance that is being provided by AI overviews. And actually, people are more satisfied with the results as well, which is also, I think, a good indication besides CTR of relevance.
So one of the points that I've made about what I think for the future of landing pages, I actually think landing pages, their days are numbered. But what you just said made me maybe rethink that. But so here's why I thought landing pages were less useful is because generative AI is such an interesting experience that people become better and better informed either on ChatGPT or having the generative experience on the Google search results page, and they have that conversation, right? And so rather than jumping away from that chat into the landing page and then figuring out more stuff, it's actually often much easier to keep having a conversation with the chatbot and get more of those answers. And so by the time you go to the landing page, I was thinking you know exactly what you want, your questions have been answered. So all you're looking for is the button to buy that thing. And so I think that's sort of my vision. But what you're saying is people actually spend more time on those landing pages. So I'm really curious if you have a take on if that chat is helping them so much, like why are they then spending more time on the landing page?
Yeah, and to be honest, I think I can not speculate too much here without oversharing. But what I would say though is I think a lot of people would agree with your initial hypothesis, and it's also something we were hearing back from clients. But yeah, as I mentioned as well, I think it also it very much depends on sort of the type of question you're asking. If you are sort of maybe have a commercial intent, as you said as well, you still need to buy the product, and maybe you're just instead of bouncing between 10 or 14 products, maybe the product that was being recommended by generative AI is just so much more relevant that the chance that you want to buy it is higher. And when you go to that landing page, as you said, you may need to do less research, but you're still very happy with the results of what you're seeing. You dig into that a little bit more and then eventually purchase a product from that advertiser.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. And so what do advertisers do to be part of this generative experience? As I understand it right now, you just have Google Ads, you place your ads, and Google will automatically decide when to show ads along with the generative experience. And that makes sense, right? But then from some other perspective, if I go to the generative AI and I say, listen, I need a PPC management software, it's going to say some things about Optimizer, it's going to say some things about other tools, and you want to make sure that's correct. So, and now we're talking about SEO a little bit, but it's about content creation. Like, how do advertisers or companies think about this interplay of SEO and PPC?
Cool. So now I think, the question is sort of what do advertisers need to do to be relevant and to show up? As you said, we don't have a specific recommendation of, okay, this is what you need to do to show in those search results. However, I think an interesting take or perspective that I shared with some colleagues, I think the things that were already important, namely providing good structural information to the ads platforms, whether that is structured text and product information through feeds, for example, or very good images, very good videos. I think all of those things that were already important in the PPC context are maybe just now amplified and even more important for the search results, which is still grounded in the Google core search systems, but with sort of the capabilities of LLM layered on top. We'll need to pull that information, and the more structurally and readily available you have that, and the better variety in terms of visual information, as well as text and feeds. I think having that crystal clear and right is the best thing that we can do to ensure that you're being shown when it's relevant.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. And even from an SEO perspective, and I know you're not going to comment on this, but the AI is very good at summarization and finding the right pieces of data. And so I think the more content that someone produces as a business about what their product does, specific use cases, that just gives the AI more information to pull from and give correct factual answers.
Yes, exactly.
So to talk to us a little bit then about like when you say feeds and images, right? We already do a lot of that stuff as advertisers. Can Gen AI also help us maybe be more creative with those things or get to 100% feed coverage? How would advertisers use these things? And maybe talk a bit about Gemini if you can.
Yeah, definitely. I think first of all, in PPC, I think there's a lot to gain through generative AI tools, whether it's creation in basically in the broadest spectrum, so creation of ads, using generative AI to create better feeds. And honestly, I think as a community, we have a lot to gain there. Like personally, for example, when I don't necessarily write ad copy anymore, but when I used to work at iProspect, to be honest, I hated writing ad copy. I was also not very good at it. Apparently, I'm not that creative. I like data and analyzing the bits to perfection a little bit more. But at the end of the day, and that's what is imprinted in me is that is what people see, right? They see your ad, so it's super important to get it right. And I think you had some discussions with former podcast guests as well with Andrew Locke and Jill, like a lot of the ads we see in PPC and the SERP are still something like buy product from price, right? And I think generative AI can help us create better and more appealing ads, but also doing that at sort of unprecedented scale and speed and iterations. And without going into the specific too much, I think where Gemini and honestly a lot of the Gen AI tools can shine is really in sort of the speed and quality of that process. Now, when it comes to Gemini, I think I personally don't necessarily like to say do like a feature comparison of different AI models. The space is evolving so quickly that maybe sometimes that also doesn't make sense. But what I would say though is that from our perspective, when it comes to Gemini, we try to make it helpful by a couple of things, and one of them is definitely to make it easy for you to use. So I think you can think about it in two ways. One is we definitely try to embed Gemini models in all of our sort of ads products. So within Google Ads, and I know sometimes for like enterprise advertisers and agencies that might not solve all the use cases, but we are bringing those capabilities of Gemini in directly into the Google Ads systems. For example, through automatically created assets, or more recently, image generator for PMAX and search. And the other way is, I think, through more applied or custom solutions that are not like official Google products, but there's a lot of great solutions, I would call them, on GitHub, which might be a bit more custom, but are a lot of our GTech teams have tried to develop templatized solutions for you that solve a specific use case. And FeedGen is an example that uses a Gemini model and is trained on the best practices of how a feed should look and how you can enhance that. And by just providing a few high quality examples, you can now have a much higher quality feed. So think about Gemini as, it is obviously a powerful AI, and we try to embed it in a lot of our products, obviously Google Ads being one of them, but then also at the same time, there are some more custom or applied solutions that we have tried to templatize that you can also use.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And so with feed gen and telling a Gen AI what is the format of the feed that needs to come out, that's a capability a lot of people don't really think about deeply. But you can even think about landing pages and how a landing page oftentimes is a template with certain fields filled out. It's a variation of Markdown, for example, or it could be a JSON file that determines which piece of text goes on what page section of that page. And so if you give Gemini the structure of that JSON or the structure of that Markdown, and then tell it, here's the product we're trying to advertise, it'll generate the full structured file that you can dump into your website and have a better landing page without actually having to manually go in and touch that landing page or have to open up the database to go through the markdown. So it can really help you scale things if you start taking advantage of these nuanced capabilities of generative AI.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then,
I think that is a super interesting point because we're talking a lot about ads, but I think in some of the clients I've worked with, it's also, I mean, first of all, obviously it's sometimes being used for campaign ideation, and our YouTube teams have some great examples of that where actually Gemini was able to come up with quite creative and nuanced things for a campaign to, for example, localize the humor from a typical US to the Netherlands, for example. But also, I work with a retailer who has very high sort of inventory turnover, so they get a lot of new products, and a lot of the times they just get a product image and like maybe one sentence of what the product is about. And I think Gen AI can really help there, especially, I mean, most of the models by now are, but Gemini definitely also is multimodal. So, taking the information from that image and turning into good text product information is something that's very powerful. And also, if you think about it, having that good product information then also allows you to be better matched in search, for example. So yeah, good points there, and definitely think broader than just ads, and also think about how to give the instructions to the Gemini models through feedgen, for example.
correct. And then you get better ads, you get higher quality score, which means you pay a lower CPC for those same clicks. So your ROAS goes up and everybody's
Exactly.
happy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also with feedgen, like, okay, it's nice to use generative AI, but I think it actually can, and we have seen that as well with quite some advertisers, have a lot of impact on the feed quality, which then in turn gives you more impressions, better CTR, lower CPC, as you said, and then better business outcomes, most importantly. And We also have, I just want to plug this in, but we have a nice sort of solution which is called FeedX, also available on GitHub, which sort of allows you to, because I think, you know, A/B testing with feeds has always been quite a challenging topic. I know there's some companies out there that have some solutions for it, but this is also just an open package that you can use to try and test FeedX. So you actually know that doing those Gen AI optimizations actually results in better outcomes.
Okay, I will put some of these in the show notes. Exactly where on GitHub to find these cool Google projects. Thanks for sharing those.
And a
Let's
disclaimer also, we always say it's not an official Google product, but it's just it uses some of the technology and strengths of Gemini, but then in a templatized way so that you don't have to do that yourself. It's a templatized solution that you can use for a specific use case, which is feed optimization, testing feeds, but also we have solutions for generating image assets and linking them to the right ad group or creating RSAs through AI, those kind of things.
Yeah. And I've used Gen AI quite a bit for writing scripts and use the
Yeah.
multimodality of it where I just go on the whiteboard and I sketch out
Oh,
this
yeah,
is the
nice. Yeah.
flow, what I would do, and then it just generates the script. Especially the latest GPT models, O1 with better reasoning, those have been really good for me in those terms. And I'm sure Google, being the company behind scripts or ad scripts, Gemini must be pretty good at that as well.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't have that much recent experience with writing scripts, but what I'm hearing from advertisers that yeah, Gen AI in general can obviously help very well with things like coding. We also have like in our cloud environment something that's called Code Assistant, but also for Google Ad scripts, yeah, it can be very powerful and it just speeds up the time that you can go to market or from ideation to the actual script. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. For myself, I used to have an idea for a script and then I'd spend a couple of days writing it, being
Exactly.
side
Yeah.
by other projects. Now it's usually like Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. I'm like, I feel like I should write one script this week. And by 5 o'clock, Gen AI has actually produced something that works. I put it on Gist, on GitHub, and it's out there, right? And it's a useful little thing that people can take advantage of for free.
Yeah.
Hey, but let's shift gears here a little bit towards reporting and analysis with generative AI. What are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, I think that's also, by the way, a super interesting space. So just leveraging generative AI to make better sense of data. We have we have Gemini in Looker as well. And I think what is particularly interesting about this is that it becomes, first of all, more conversational experience. And by asking or prompting questions, you actually get visualizations from data sets in the terms of graphs or tables. And then next to that, you can also ask it to explain that to you. So it almost becomes like a commentator or a narrator to say, okay, give me this data. And then you see a graph, and then you say, okay, explain the trend here. What are the three key takeaways, etc. And those are things we have in that Gemini helps with in Looker, but we also have Google Ads report generator now that's also based on Gemini, where it can actually help you make sense of the data and even create slides, for example, or a summary. And so I think in that space, it's also super powerful.
Nice, I love it. And we have some optimizer labs capabilities. So one of them is a slide builder, but yeah, and basically narrate your PPC performance and then say, look at the last 30 days of data and tell me five things I could have done better, five optimization suggestions or whatever it is. And it's funny because you go to the Gen AI and you say, tell me five happy things about the account. You take those, you go and talk to your client. You're like, hey, we've done amazing work this week or this month. And then they're like, yeah, keep going, thumbs up. And you turn around to that same AI and you're like, hey, what are five things I did wrong in this account? And it's, yeah, here's five things you could fix to make your client even happier next month. So it's really cool how it's like that sideline player, that coach. And it's
Yeah.
also really good for training, is what I find. If you want to get into statistics, but you don't necessarily deeply understand it, Gen AI will spit out like a chart, but you can actually say, explain this chart to me. Like, how was the data analyzed? What look back windows? And maybe what are the pitfalls that I should be worried about? And what's so cool is I think so much education that we get is through reading web pages, looking at YouTube videos, and everything is structured the way that somebody else thought we should consume it. But with Gen AI, you can jump back and forth and you can make it work for how you like to learn. And that's what makes it so unique and powerful.
Yeah, and I think what's also in the reporting space was quite interesting. I was looking at tagging along with a cloud colleague with a Looker demo, and then by asking those questions, it generated reports, etc. But the interesting part is, I think you don't have to be good at coding, for example, yourself to now get those insights, right? And then if you open up that the SQL code is actually being written in the background to produce the visual from the database. I think that is just, even though I work in this space quite a lot, I do find that quite mind-boggling, and it just makes this sort of getting insights much more accessible for everyone maybe in the company, and you're not having to rely on people, pulling and creating those data sets yourself. So as I said, you don't need to be a coder anymore. I think that by asking a prompt, the code, sort of SQL code, is being generated in the background. So it makes getting these type of insights and data much more accessible to a larger audience within a company, for example. So I think that is also a very powerful part of generative AI, definitely.
And I think that's a perfect segue there into you can do things yourself that maybe in the past you would have had to ask other people within the team. What is your take on the future of the PPC specialist? What do we do to future proof ourselves and make sure that we're still, I don't know, I don't know if we need a job, but we still need income probably. So, how do we maintain income?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think there's a few interesting angles to this. And first, maybe a thought is it's a bit like maybe like at least the Dutch folks would call it a bit cheesy, but I still find there's truth in the sentence that we show in some of our decks is that some as a marketer, I don't think you're sort of competing against AI, but you're competing against marketers that use it a lot and try to make the most sense out of it. So I think the first point is don't fight this, but actually ensure that you're getting very good at using predictive, but also generative AI in your job, and then see how you can work and get better at that, and maybe a better understanding of what works and what doesn't. And I think, to be honest, the true single channel PPC specialist is maybe not enough anymore. And I think you don't really have an excuse anymore to be that. Gen AI and all the tools that are out there allow you to free up a lot of time for other more strategic things. And I think the future for a specialist role is to be a bit more broad, a bit more T-shaped. And there are things that are maybe still, at least today, too complex for AI, which touches upon projects that are multidisciplinary. So think about the example that I put in the beginning, like data activation always needs like the data team and PPC. How do we make sure that's aligned? Or how do we prove to the CFO that our investment is actually worth it? How do we prove incrementality of a certain channel or prove what the role search is in the total media mix and how that search data is actually being fed into the model? So I think taking a step back, becoming more strategic, more T-shaped is definitely the way forward. I also asked Gemini actually, because from your book, I think you talk about the PPC doctor, pilot, and teacher. Ask him to come up with a fourth role based on what I just said. And I think something like along the lines of either a chef or a preacher or an orchestra director, which oversees multiple moving parts and tries to connect that all together and sets the direction of what we need to do in a certain channel. That is how I would describe the role of the PPC specialist in the future.
Nice. Yeah, I wrote one post where I equated it to a restaurateur because
Mm,
chef was kind of getting close, and it was on the principle that you can go to these chat assistants and you can say, "Cook me a great dish," and it cooks you something amazing, but you hate it, right? Because and the default is that you didn't tell it what are your dietary
yeah,
restrictions, what are the ingredients you like. And so, one funny thing about these chat systems is that the more restrictions you put on them, the better they actually become at coming up with innovative, cool new things. So, give it more boundaries and tell it who you're making this dish for, and then it's going to come up with something great. And so, that's the role where you have to know how to prompt it, how to work with it to pull the right thing out of it. And that actually also goes back a little bit to the whole localization example that you mentioned before. One of my favorite examples is exactly like you said, write the same ad, but not just translate it from English to Dutch, but make it funny to a Dutch person. And what
exactly.
funny to a Dutch person is different from an American person. Like we watch different shows, we different sensitivities, right? And I actually did this for an ad for a floral delivery service. I asked it to localize it to a Parisian audience, and it started introducing the word elegance or elegance in French.
Mm.
And it said, well, people in Paris, like that's a common word they use or that they seek. And the next day, I see an ad for Air France, and it actually has the word elegance on it. And so very clearly, it's that I thought GPT was making it up, but clearly it understands that's like a local sensitivity that makes sense to incorporate in those ads.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another way to think about it was, and this I think this analogy was already true. PPC especially for the future, you have to be an input master. So inputting the right data into the having clear goals and putting in the right data into the systems is one. But then in the generative AI space, as you said, input master is maybe more things like having the right prompts and the right context for those models. So input master, but also then an output evaluator, and everything in the middle can be maybe taken care of by AI powered media buying, all the different campaign types that you have heard and discussed a lot about within Google Ads, but then evaluating that output, putting it into context in the overall marketing mix, proving incrementality, all those kind of things I think are still super, super valuable as well. Move away from the campaign management part and focus on becoming an input master and a very good output evaluator.
Yeah. Hey, Ted, it's been fantastic having you on, and thanks for sharing all those amazing insights about generative AI and how you can make the most of that within the Google Ads framework. If people want to get in touch or learn more about the stuff you talked about, what should they do?
Yeah, so you can follow me on LinkedIn. I don't have a nice URL here, but maybe you can add that later. But yeah,
Mhm.
follow me on LinkedIn, or and if you reach out, I will definitely get back to you, and we can also stay in touch through my Google email. Also, if you are at events around the Amsterdam area, I don't think I'll be in the US anytime soon, but yeah, hopefully to see you in March, definitely at Friends of Search. So yeah, please reach out if you do have any questions.
Great. And for everyone watching, we'll put Ted's LinkedIn in the show notes as well as a bunch of other of the stuff he's talked about. So with that, we'll wrap up another episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please like it, please subscribe. You'll get notified about future ones. And with that, thanks for watching PPC Town Hall, and we'll see you for the next one.